Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Canadians with Disabilities and Their Allies. I'm your host, Brent, the weatherman. Settle in and get ready for a conversation with our special guest. Hi, Eric.
Hi, Brent. Thanks for having me on.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for coming by. It's a pleasure having you on the show today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. My name is Eric Doherty. I'm a transportation planning consultant in Victoria, BC, and I've got quite a bit of experience doing work on handy-dart issues in Metro Vancouver. And fairly recently, I've been involved in a group called Greater Victoria Acting Together. And we put forward a proposal to allow wheelchair and mobility scooter users to use the bike and roll routes along with cyclists and skateboarders if they choose to do so. It got unanimous support from City Council. And we understand that City Council has now been, or the city staff has now been talking to the province, and we're just waiting to hear back and see what the province has to say.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds great. And there's so many moving pieces, with that. Accessibility is so important these days. I mean, and going green and getting people out of their vehicles and taking public transit for sure.
Yeah, and it's it's a disability rights issue in more than one way, because when we're taking climate action, we're changing the way the city operates. It's fairly obvious that people with disabilities should be front and center in making sure that what the changes that we make actually make the city more accessible, make it better for people with disabilities. But it's also, the fact is that the climate crisis has impacts on people with disabilities that are worse than the general public. For example, the heat wave in BC that killed 600 people. We know that a fairly high percentage of those people who died, much larger number who got seriously ill, were people with disabilities, and that part of that is just their physical condition, but a lot of it the kind of housing that they live in that was not kept to a good standard. They're in low-income neighborhoods without trees, and they don't have air conditioning. So there's all these different things that we need to be dealing with.
Oh, absolutely, and that is part of I think part of the strategic planning that a lot of the municipalities are now doing. I know the province has stepped in and that they want to move forward in making sure that any housing that's getting built will be on transit routes that will make it more accessible for people to get to and from, and make it more affordable too, right? I mean, up standards, because a lot of buildings just have not been kept up to industry standards, right? They've just been left to fall apart, and I mean, like you say, no air conditioning either. With that heat wave, it's just been brutal. I think there's just an industry standard that needs to be changed on that to make them mandatory, that any building that gets built has air conditioning built in.
Yeah, and that's something that a lot of environmental groups and anti-poverty groups and disability rights organizations are now pushing for, is that not only new buildings but existing buildings have heat pumps, which is a very efficient form of electrical heating in the wintertime, but it's also a high capacity, efficient air conditioning when it gets really hot. And yeah, it's a way of getting away from burning fossil gas to heat our buildings, to deal with the climate crisis, reduce greenhouse gas pollution, but also make life better for people.
Yeah, and that's So important, right? Because people have to have the right choices of where they live on the transportation on the routes, and having it affordable so they can kind of intertwine, so they're not spending a lot of time commuting to and from where they need to go. And yeah, I mean, accessibility wise, of making sure that the bus routes, for instance, will get you to the ferry on time. I know in Victoria, I'm going to be taking a voyage tomorrow, Sonia and myself, and a couple people that we know. And the first bus doesn't leaves downtown, but from where we are, we can't catch the first bus, so we have to take a cab, unless I catch another ferry, which is 2 hours later. So yeah, and it's that's an accessibility issue for sure. And I mean, we got a lot of bike lanes here, which is great, but I don't have a bike, so I wish I did. I mean, I want to try and invest in getting one.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, is that for people with disabilities, a lot of people with disabilities ride conventional transit. Some people with disabilities can ride bicycles, standard bicycles, or adapted cycles, trikes. And the one thing that most people with disabilities can't do is own their own car, just because of, even if they can drive, the financial cost of owning a car and keeping it maintained and insured and all that is out of reach of many people. But I also just wanted to mention that about this issue is that I don't use a mobility scooter or a wheelchair, and it was actually a Victoria resident, Peter Foran, who uses a motorized wheelchair, who is the person who is really the most convincing spokesperson on this issue. And he spoke to the on CBC. I've just tweeted that out, a link to the CBC article and the recording. I just wanted to read a quick quote from it. He said, quote, "I looked at the sidewalks being full and these beautiful new bike lanes and decided that it was the fastest and least bumpy way to get downtown." And he just started doing it. He just started using them, then realized that there's this whole legal issue where, the logical thing to do to use this new infrastructure, that the regulations or the laws, or at least the interpretation of them, hasn't caught up. In this case, cities have been building protected bike routes for a long time. People in wheelchairs and mobility scooters have been using them, but our Motor Vehicle Act dates back to the 1920s, the ideas in it, and it's never been updated to fully recognize mobility scooter. There has been an amendment that's not enforced about electric wheelchairs and mobility scooters as a form of micromobility, but that's just about pilot projects, which seems like a really awkward way to do something that's really a no-brainer. It's a human right, and we're hoping that the province is going to get back to the city, and with just either a commitment to modify the act, or just an interpretation of the act that says you can do this, because the Motor Vehicle Act doesn't talk about bike lanes. It doesn't talk about mobility scooters. It doesn't talk about wheelchairs. And all the minister probably has to do is sign a piece of paper saying, we accept that mobility scooters and wheelchairs are legitimate users of bike and roll routes.
Yeah, and it's so easy to incorporate that in by just signing, like you say, signing a piece of paper, document, and implementing that in. Yeah, I mean, because it is all. I mean, this all makes sense of basically just making things more accessible for people. I mean, there's different modes of transportation that works best for people of their disability. I mean, like some people can ride a conventional bike, or there's different modes of bikes that people can use as scooters. I mean, around my neighborhood, I see all sorts of neat devices for sure. I've seen one with one wheel. I don't know how people can keep a balance on that, but yeah, I mean, it's quite neat. I've just seen people using those bike lanes and along transit routes too, and and getting to the issue of like the housing that would be kind of going along there in those routes of having like supportive types of housing that currently exist, that that are already there, but for persons with disabilities that needs like heating and cooling, and like say 25 degrees in the summer and 18 degrees in the winter would be perfect. And just incorporating all these ideas and putting it to work. And I mean, as a lot of the planners like within government of like behind it, they need to kind of collaborate all together and make things more of a prosperous environment for people, to get off the fossil fuels so much, right? And I know that a lot of the conventional buses now are trying to go green, right? They're looking at reducing down emissions and the carbon footprints for sure, right?
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention something about go back to the legal questions, because my impression of this is that the government, the way that the government has been interpreting the law, the provincial government has been interpreting the Motor Vehicle Act, is a human rights violation. And the city staff at the City of Victoria, when they were discussing this, seemed to be implying that the law was unenforceable because it was a human rights violation, an unreasonable human rights violation. So I think that there's really three paths where this can be changed. One is by formally changing the legislation, whether that's pilot projects or however it goes. The other is to just have the minister interpret the act in such a way as to allow this very reasonable use of bike and roll routes. And the third one is that it goes through some kind of a human rights, some kind of legal human rights complaint process, either as an individual or as a group effort. Because, and I think that's, that is often how government things change, is governments realize that if they don't change it proactively and be heroes, they're going to end up with in front of a human rights group or in the courts, and it's going to end up on the headlines of the papers of them being, the bad guys. Yeah, I'm actually about to post a link on my Twitter in the thread that I mentioned that I've got you tagged in, Brent, for a group called Let's Ride, which is a campaign for intercommunity public transit system across BC. And the interesting thing is that BC Transit actually runs long-distance highway buses in northern BC. It's called BC Bus North. And they're highway coaches with washrooms and wheelchair lifts, and that's the kind of service that, and much better than what they've got in northern BC, is the kind of service that the Let's Ride campaign is about getting, and it's a campaign that's been endorsed by the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, because access to transportation between communities is a Indigenous rights issue. People's right to access education, healthcare, services, employment, all sorts of issues. To me, it's interesting that in northern BC, they got the BC Bus North service because Indigenous groups were campaigning for it, and all the municipalities and community groups, everybody backed them up. So I think this is, I'll post that link on Twitter, but I'll just read it out also. It's bcwidebus.com.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to that link. And definitely, any of the listeners right now, what Eric had just mentioned, definitely check out the link that he will be posting under his profile there, and definitely take a look at that.